a lot of people forecast global plagues of one sort or the other. I mean, that goes all the way back to, some people say that it was actually Edgar Allan Poe who was the first science fiction writer, and there is something to suggest that. I don't agree with it, but he did write a kind of proto-SF. And one of his stories, The Mask of the Red Death, and he talked about a global plague of some sort or the other. I thought quite a bit about this, and about the past visions of pandemics and global diseases like this, and how they matched up against what we got. And there are places where we got it right, and there are places that we got it wrong. The place where we got it right was that science fiction writers did imagine a disease that would cross national barriers, cross oceans, be spread very, very quickly, and be 100% contagious. They even got it right where it would lead to people having to isolate themselves from each other from one extent to the other. There were two places that they got it wrong. One was that it was thought that a disease like this would not only be 100% contagious, but also 100% fatal. Fortunately, we didn't get that. I mean, it certainly puts you down. I can tell you that what that's like, but it didn't kill me. It has killed a lot of people, but it's not killed everybody. The other place that SF writers got it wrong, tragically, was that we always imagined a competent response by the government.
Hey, Allen.
Hello, hi.
So, Jules Verne, is that the first science fiction story, kind of?
I say that Jules Verne was the first science fiction writer, but he did not publish. He did not write the first science fiction story. Most people who are historians pretty much agree that that was Mary Shelley with Frankenstein. She created, what's generally known as the Frankenstein story, the warning story.
Some people would ascribe that to Lord Byron too, right?
Byron, I'm not sure.
Because they were all together, Byron and
Yeah,
Shelley.
well, they were all, yeah, that was the famous story that the whole bunch of them were all said together, and they were supposed to all write a scary story during that summer.
Yeah,
and I've been told though that Shelley's story is not just the best, but it's really the only readable one.
Yeah.
The others, and which is really great because she was a teenager. I mean, she was a teenage bride, and there must have been some condescension of, "Oh yes, Mary,
Yeah.
go ahead and write your story." We all nod, but nobody remembers any of those other ones.
Yeah.
They've all become forgotten and obscure.
When we think about interstellar space travel, though, which you've written about quite extensively, where are the beginnings of that? Is that Jules Verne?
That takes us back to Jules Verne.
Yeah.
I mean, the interplanetary stories go all the way back, but most of them are mythological.
Right.
They were people going into space by putting dew into bottles, and the evaporating dew would carry them into space.
Right.
The legendary story of Wan Hu, the Chinese emperor, who strapped himself to a chair with all these rockets, and then they lit him off, and he disappeared into a puff of smoke. But Verne was the first one with From Earth to the Moon and its sequel to Around the Moon to take some serious thought into that. And then later, he wrote the story that's usually known as Off on a Comet, which was an interplanetary story. But that happened by natural means. A comet sweeps close to the Earth and literally tears off an island with a number of people on it, and the people who, including the French soldier who is the narrator of the story, Hector, I cannot remember his last name. That's the original title of the book. Through his eyes and the eyes of everybody else who are on this comet, they get a tour of the solar system. And we see the solar system as it was imagined in the late 1800s. Before said comet, fortuitously returns and brings them back and it drops them right back on Earth, safe and sound.
Now, does Jules Verne presage a lot of the ideas that we're still dealing with? Like, like a lock between the exterior and the interior and things like that, which seem maybe small, but are super important to how we eventually developed real space flight?
Yeah, I think so. I wrote an article some years ago when I was still a journalist recounting the number of ways that Verne's from Earth to the Moon and around the moon. I hate to use the word predict because science fiction doesn't predict the future. It forecasted the way the Apollo missions happened. I mean, and he got it right on a number of things. I mean, the only thing that he didn't. Hello, Ika. My dog just showed up. But anyway, where was I?
Oh, we were talking, but actually, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm sorry to interrupt, but just for our audience to understand that you went from you made your living as a journalist, but had this incredible passion as a young man in science. You don't really call it fiction. I mean, you call it something else, hard science or whatever.
Well, I call it science fiction. Hard science fiction is the label that's attached to the kind of science fiction that I write. And I've always had sort of a little bit of an argument with that. You know, the first time that anybody called me a hard science fiction writer was the editor who bought my first book. And I first thought was to correct her and say, no, I'm not a hard science fiction writer. I'm just to write science fiction. And then this little voice in the back of my head said, dummy, she wants to buy your first book. She can call it whatever she wants.
Exactly.
You know? So but I generally call it science fiction. If I had to describe myself, I write a traditional form of science fiction. The SF that I write is science-based.
Right.
And it's very speculative.
Now, when you do Coyote, you know, it's futuristic, but it's also the root of it is more American history, no?
Yes, it is.
Is that you're putting something back in the past? You're taking the things from the past and putting them into the future to see what might happen?
What happened? Well, let me tell you how that happened. Coyote is the story of the first starship from Earth and the first interstellar colony. And it's a sort of, and when you get into the novel, you realize that it's a retelling of the story of the founding of this country. And that's essentially what it is. But that was not the intent to begin with. The intent, when I started researching Coyote, and it went through, by the way, 2 false starts before I finally figured out what I was doing. There were 2 attempts to write the book that failed. I wanted to write almost the anti-Star Trek. When I started working on the book, Star Trek The Next Generation was on the air and it was a big hit. And I liked the show. You know, I watched the first few seasons. I enjoyed it. But it got to annoy me after a while because it had this very utopian and not very realistic view of what interstellar travel was going to be like.
How did you know that?
Space travel has been something that has fascinated me ever since I was a little kid. And I've read much about this, not just science fiction, but a lot of science too. All the reliable speculation tells us that interstellar travel, if and when we get it, is going to look nothing like Star Trek. And I said I wanted to do a more realistic look and to have, you know, a ship that wasn't supposed to be a luxury liner. It's just a ship on a runway mission. The crew is not a highly trained, omnicompetent crew that's loyal to the captain and does whatever he says and gets along with everybody else at all times. The planets aren't going to look, forgive me, like California parks. It's going to be a tough, grueling mission, and it's going to require living off the land and a lot of ingenuity on the part of people doing this, and a lot of danger. When I finally figured out what I was doing and began working on the thing, I began to realize about halfway through that I was retelling the story of the discovery of America, of first Christopher Columbus, but really more the Mayflower story and what it was like to establish the New World colonies in that way. And in fact, this was a complete coincidence. I did not realize at the time when I designed my starship in the mission, one of the things I had to figure out is how many people you're going to be putting aboard this thing. And all the research that I indicated said that you need to put at least 100 people aboard. You need at least 100 people for a viable colony. And so I worked it out to about 104. 104 people is exactly how many people were aboard the Mayflower.
Wow.
Did you know that after the fact?
I didn't realize that until I was well on the way into the story, and I went, "Oh my God!" I actually picked that number out of nowhere, and when I realized what I was doing, I said, "Okay, well, we can either stop and go back and do this Star Trek, anti-Star Trek thing again, or we can run with it and see where it takes you. And I thought, let's the latter. Let's see what happens. And it turned out to be not just a better novel, but I began using Sturgeon's rule. Theodore Sturgeon, one of the great writers of science fiction, had a saying, and he said, ask the next question. And he used it as a way of generating stories. When you're building a science fiction story, you ask a question, what if? And then you answer that question, and that poses another question. And then what if this happened? And you work your way down the line. And that's how you build a science fiction story. When I realized that I was retelling the Mayflower story and retelling early American history, and I began to follow this, that led me not only to writing Coyote, but led me on to write 4 more novels after that, and kept writing until I ran out of story.
Now, Elon Musk wants to go to Mars, build a colony inside a lava tunnel, on Mars. What's your, and I mean, I don't think we're anywhere near being able to do that, but he is testing these giant rockets.
I think it's entirely doable. And yes, we can. The lava tunnels have been something that space scientists have looked at, not just for Mars, but also the moon for quite a long time now. I mean, the only thing I don't like about it is that, it's a bit like living like a rodent. There's going to have to be some component of the base that's going to have to be above ground, where you're out in the light and so forth. Otherwise, you're going to have your people feeling like rats after a while. Not good for morale. But otherwise, it's a perfectly viable way of doing it. It's a good way of radiation protection and so forth. As far as getting there, I don't see any reason why not. I mean, I've looked at the proposal for his spacecraft, and provided that it could be built, and actually building the thing it's going to take quite a bit. No doubt about it. Question is going to be, is he going to have enough money to do this? That's been the holdup with all space exploration for the last 50 years. It's the old no buck Rogers question.
Now, we can get down in those lava tubes, but there's no oxygen in it. How do you envision bringing oxygen?
Well, you got to grow it. There's no way that you can bring enough oxygen with you from Earth in tanks to supply a Mars base. I mean, it's not going to be anything like the Apollo missions, where we brought everything with us for 3-day journeys. I think at first it will be through extracting breathable oxygen from the CO2 atmosphere and combining that with whatever hydrogen we can find in the ground. That's why the discovery of groundwater will be so important. Long term, it will be through greenhouses. It'll be through, I was about to say hydroponics, but without the hydroponic.
Right.
We'll be learning how to do gardening, but in a very different way, a very water conservative way of doing this. I think that in this respect, one of the most predictive novels that we've seen is Frank Herbert's Dune, because he was talking about how to live on another planet in a very water conservative sort of way.
Now, interstellar space travel, we look at it on Star Trek and we sort of get to the next planet at warp 10, very quickly. I don't know that that's really been validated in any real way. So, I think that travel is going to take a really, really long time.
Yeah.
So how do you think about actual space travel versus, the way we see it now?
Well, that was what I was trying to get at with Coyote. And then I took another approach in a later novel, Arkwright. In Coyote, I went with a form of hibernation that I called biostasis. Instead of freezing people, which could cause a lot of cellular damage, particularly to the brain, I went with a sort of a way of preserving human bodies and replacing the cell. Basically put somebody in an artificial coma for a long period of time. And then while they're there, you're replacing the cells. So you put somebody who's, say, 30 years old into this kind of biostasis, and you keep them alive for, in the case of Coyote, around 230 years for it to reach the world you're going to. And then they come out of it, and they're still essentially the same 30-year-old person who came into them, even though they're really now more like about 280 years old.
Didn't the movie just do that, where they put somebody into the pod? Wasn't that a famous science fiction movie that came out recently?
Yeah, they were stolen from my book.
Was it, which one was it? Was that wasn't,
The movie Passengers.
that's what it was.
Yeah, well, read part 2 of Coyote, and you'll see
Okay,
amazing similarities there.
right, okay. Well, thank you for,
I mean, unfortunately, SF writers get ripped off like this a lot.
No, did you grow up reading the original Captain Future?
Oh, yes. When I was 11 years old, I went to a drugstore in Franklin, Tennessee, where my family's originally from there. And my father went there to pick up a prescription for my grandmother. And, I was already an avid reader by then. And I went over to the paperback rack and I came upon this paperback, Outlaws of the Moon by Edmund Hamilton. And it was a Captain Future novel. And it just cover just looked cool as hell. And I asked my dad if I could buy it, gave me the money, and I bought it, took it home, and loved it. It was dated. I mean, I could already tell that it was outdated. But it was the first case of my reading an outdated novel and not caring.
Right.
The story was just so good that I loved it. And I began trying to track down other paperback reprints. I didn't even realize at the time that this was a reprint of a pulp magazine story from the 1940s.
Right.
And so that was my first exposure to not only the Captain Future, but to pulp fiction as a whole, which is now, I mean, that's another lifelong fascination that I have, is with pulps.
it is interesting, you went to the drugstore and there became this incredible, infatuation, obsession, lifelong thing. It's not random, of course, because I don't believe in random. I think things happen. Jesse will argue with me
It's
about that.
happy accidents, let's put it that way.
All right, we won't get into that. But one thing that struck me, but when you were just talking about, all the you the 104 and you're doing all this research, it seems to me that, right now with the things that are happening in the world, we just had everything happening at COP, like how important is, how do we use science fiction and science fiction writers to help us figure out, we're sort of in crisis times always, probably all generations feel that way. How do we use minds like yours to help problem solve? Like, is there a role for you to be coming together?
Well, I think the first role that science fiction writers have in that is that we preserve hope. I mean, there's a lot of dystopian science fiction out there, and this pile of books that I have now next to me that I got for the Philip K. Dick Award. I mean, there's no shortage of dystopian novels in there, and some of them are pretty good. But the ones that I've been impressed with, or the ones that I've always been impressed with, are the kind of science fiction that says, yeah, we can survive these times. Captain Future was written in the middle of World War II, for God's sakes. How grim can you get? And it showed us a future where humankind had gone out by 1992. In fact, that was when the Captain Future stories originally took place, was in the far distant year of 1992, that we would survive all of this and we'd go out and populate the solar system and have great adventures. And there's still the role for that. But beyond that, we also the fact that science fiction can serve as a kind of a test bed for ideas, that you can take ideas and using that Theodore Sturgeon device, ask the next question. He even had a symbol for it. It showed a Q with an arrow pointing out of it. And if you follow that process, you can come up with possible, even plausible ideas for solutions for many different things. The trick is doing this and telling a good, entertaining story at the same time. Like I said earlier, science fiction doesn't predict the future, but I think that it does a real good job of inspiring it. And I think that every now and then somebody sees something in a science fiction story and says, I wonder if we could actually make this. I wonder if we could do this. I wonder if there's something to this theory. And they follow it. And it takes them someplace that we haven't gone before. That's the most important thing that I think that science fiction does.
How important is research before you write?
Essential. I mean, I'm speaking for me. I know writers who don't do any research at all. I don't know how they function. I do a lot of research. And essentially my method is that I come up with an idea for a story and I play with it for a while. And
so the research might start before there's a story.
The story begins first. I kind of get out of somewhere, I get an idea for a story. And then I play around with it. And if I think there's something there, then I begin to do the research. And the research can take an awful long time. The research and development of my stories can take months, even years. I'll be doing other stories during this. I don't just concentrate on one thing. Here, let me show you something, if you can see my desk. Here's my desk. You see this pile of papers?
Right.
These are all scientific papers of one sort or another that I've culled. And all of these have to do with something that I'm or some story or another that I'm working on. And and I read them and I highlight them, and that's part of the building. It's sort of part of the process. All those books back there on those shelves are my research library, and those are things that I've read and marked up and bookmarked and all of that, and that's what I use to develop. It can take an awful long time, and so the method that I kind of used for this is I call it one plane on the runway and two planes in the hangar.
Right.
And I do this, and as a result of that, it's a good method. The only time I have a block is when I get just exhausted. Unfortunately, I just came off of a block. I wrote during the pandemic. I worked on 4 books. That was my way of dealing with it, and I got it. So I published 4 books this year.
Wow.
And I got through writing the last one earlier this spring, and it was just, I can't write anymore.
How long did it take you before you started again?
About 3 weeks ago.
Oh my God. Let me ask you a question. In science fiction or in your work or others, who is talking about the potential of the pandemic? I mean, it was in there, right? It's in there. Many writers have written about it.
The pandemic, yeah. A lot of people forecast global plagues of one sort or the other. I mean, that goes all the way back to, some people say that it was actually Edgar Allan Poe who was the first science fiction writer, and there is something to suggest that. I don't agree with it, but he did write a kind of proto-SF. And one of his stories, The Mask of the Red Death, he talked about a global plague of some sort or the other. I thought quite a bit about this, and about the past visions of pandemics and global diseases like this, and how they matched up against what we got. And there are places where we got it right, and there are places that we got it wrong. The place where we got it right was that science fiction writers did imagine a disease that would cross national barriers, cross oceans, be spread very, very quickly, and be 100% contagious. They even got it right where it would lead to people having to isolate themselves from each other from one extent to the other. There were 2 places that they got it wrong. One was that it was thought that a disease like this would not only be 100% contagious, but also 100% fatal. Fortunately, we didn't get that. I mean, it certainly puts you down. I can tell you that what that's like, but it didn't kill me. It has killed a lot of people, but it's not killed everybody. The other place that SF writers got it wrong, tragically, was that we always imagined a competent response by the government. We always thought that our government would respond to this in a sane and responsible manner. And without getting too political about this, I think it's pretty obvious that did not happen in this country, at least not in the United States. Other countries, yes, but not here. We should not have lost as many people as we had if we had a sane and responsible government that didn't even admit that we were having a plague until it was too big to ignore. So science fiction, again, we try to forecast these things, and sometimes we get it right, but there's very rarely any cases where even our best forecasts get it all the way right. But we do at least give people some kind, if you're willing to listen, some kind of an idea of where things might stand, where things might go, if you're willing to listen.
If you trace a line back to Einstein, going back to 1902, every subsequent scientific discovery happens on top of the past generation. Is there a similar thing with science fiction writers that get us to these concepts of does Asimov lead us steadily forward to each person pulling apart a more fine grain of it?
It's kind of I've described it as being kind of a great game. it's a matter of, hey, top this. And we've been playing this for generations, where a science fiction writer writes a story and somebody else reads it and says, yeah, that's kind of good, but what if you did this instead? And you wrote another story and you tried to write the better than that guy's story. And then somebody else comes along and says, yeah, that's pretty interesting. But what if you did this? And then somebody else. I mean, Asimov is a perfect example. Isaac Asimov's robot stories were based on him being disgusted with the killer robot story up to the 1930s. If you go back and read Pulp Fiction, whenever there were robots on the scene, it almost always would go amok and start killing people. Just sometimes because they're there, It's always the mad scientists building the robots that go out and kill people just because it can be done. Or robots being used as murder weapons, something like this. Asimov looked at these and asked the big question, why? Why would you actually go out there and build a machine that could kill you? Wouldn't you build in to its programming ways to prevent this from happening? And he started coming up with, he didn't even call it the 3 laws of robotics. It was actually, he came up with them. And then his editor at Astounding, who was publishing these stories, codified it. And he said, Isaac, do you realize what you've done here? You've devised 3 laws of robotics. Huh? I didn't know what you're talking about. Yeah, and here they are. And Campbell listed these things, and he got these from Asimov's own stories himself. So Asimov revolutionized the robot story, and people began working onto that. Unfortunately, now we're back to the killer robot story. I mean, we've kind of gone full circle. And now, unfortunately, just about I've got a bunch of stories down here too, which are killer robot stories. Or the twist on now is the new fad, it seems to be, is the killer AI story. We're going to invent an artificial intelligence that's going to go out there and want to kill us. Why? Well, just because we're here.
Right.
No particular reason. We're just here. And I've actually written about that and given reasons why I don't think that would happen. And that's my response to that. So SF writers do. We do respond to each other over a period of time. It's this long conversation that's gone for generations. It's like a bull session that just keeps going and going and going and going and going.
Is it collegial or is it competitive?
Both.
Both.
I think it's more collegial, though, than anything else. My buddies and I, other writers who I know, we kick back and forth ideas all the time. And we sometimes trade. I've even traded ideas. I've thought of something and I've given it to them. They've thought of things and given it to me. The only time I've ever been ripped off is by Hollywood.
All of us share that.
You do.
When you go to dinner with a couple of writers, are you just dreaming about the future together? It's not about whose story is what story. It's dreaming about what's possible.
Sometimes it's just a conversation. A lot of times you go to conventions and you go out to dinner, and a lot of times, unfortunately, it's us griping about our editors. And, we don't get paid enough and they don't advertise our books. And how the hell did that guy win an award for his book, and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
But when the conversation is actually good, it's when somewhere along the line, it goes and becomes a book session and you start talking about space travel, or robotics, or AI, or whatever it happens to come up in conversation. And when that happens, you very often see somebody, suddenly pull out a notebook and a pen and scribble down something real fast and put it away. I do that all the time.
If Elon Musk hadn't been born and wasn't out here, would you have to have written him?
Well, Elon Musk was actually predicted. His name was Tony Stark. I thought the greatest bit in one of the Iron Man movies is when Tony Stark meets Elon Musk. And I thought, oh, that's great. That is so perfect. The Elon Musk character is a staple of science fiction. The genius who invents a device that changes the world.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different examples of fictional Elon, not just Elon Musk, but Jeff Bezos and Stephen Hawking and a number of other great minds. You could find fictional paradigms to these people.
Well, Allen, thank you very much for spending so much time with us today. We really appreciate it.
It's been so pleasant that I didn't realize the time had passed.
Time flies, as we said.
Thank you, Allen, very much.
Hey, it has been my pleasure, and it's been great to meet you all.
Well, it's a big, bright universe. It's awfully big.
It is, but to go back to Mary Shelley and think it all started, the early woman who was predicting these monsters that really will exist is pretty interesting, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
I didn't think about it like that. So
yeah, it's great.
I'm gonna go brush up on not my Shakespeare, but my science fiction.
No, you can do both.
Okay, see you later.
Bye.
Bye.